Yeah, we can see the MonSec logo.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Peter. I'm MonSec secretary, and probably my favorite thing of cybersecurity is networking and corporate networks, Windows especially, all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to try and make this as interactive as possible throughout. Please feel free to stop me at any point and ask any questions, and let me know if you can't hear me or you have any other problems like that. So I guess before I start, I'd just like to put it out to the audience. What do people think corporate networking would involve from a cybersecurity perspective? Okay, I'll answer my own question then. So I think corporate networks are about pretty much anything to do with a company, and I think it's probably best demonstrated through what sort of things a corporate network involves. So really it's computers, switches, servers are probably the most immediate ones that might come to mind. But then there are other things like firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems, IDS/IPS, VPNs are a really big part, but becoming less important now as we move more to cloud. For example, Google, I think, has nothing requiring VPN now, which is pretty amazing. And also SIEM, which is basically like logging, collation, and real-time analysis of events and incidents. So obviously every network is different. You have different devices, different appliances, different software running on those, different protocols in use, different number of users, and importantly, you have different business objectives and I guess different levels of importance placed on a network. And so obviously, I guess the internet is the largest network, and every company has a corporate network. And large companies have very complicated corporate networks. But even small companies, like your home router is a network, and it's a very simple and small network, but it is still a network. And obviously, having a different having a different size of network or different companies gives you a whole lot of power if you can take control of that network. So let's just have a think about what the sort of things we might see on a network and how they might either help us when we come to attack a network or how they might slow an attack. So I really want to open it to the audience here. Feel free to come off mute and just start from top of the list and work out what does the DNS server do? Okay, it looks like I'm going to be answering my own questions. That's fine. So the DNS server is responsible for taking domain names and translating them to IP addresses. And that's really important is the entirety of the network and the entirety normal function of the internet, because we don't want to type in IP addresses all the time. But this is also a really important attack vector because it allows us to redirect people to devices that we control, and that means that'll be the first step in a man-in-the-middle attack, which allows us to see all the data going through to a particular client or a particular website. So if we can get control of the DNS server, that's a really important attack vector. DHCP server, that hands out the IP addresses on the network. If we get control of that, we can potentially see what's happening on the network, because the DHCP server might serve the entire network, for example, parts of the network that we can't even see, which means it may also be a useful vector for jumping between different parts of the network, for example, or it might just give us information, or it allows us to just, I guess, if we take that offline, and we could disrupt the network if that's our main goal. So there's possibilities there. Or might mean we flood IT with support tickets if we take the DHCP server offline, which may help with social engineering. So there's possibilities. Switches and routers. So a switch, and we'll router nowadays because we have level 3 switches, these are sort of included, that's what I guess we can include in the same dot point, is what moves data around the network and connects different networks to each other. So if we can control the switching and the routing, we can gain a huge amount of access to the network, and we can even change how the network works in our favor. A lot of networks use what is called virtual LANs, VLANs. And so what this does is, let's say you want to have the office network and the CCTV cameras, but you want to separate them, but you've only got one physical cable going from, say, the first floor to the second floor, but you don't want the two to be on the same network. If you use a VLAN, you can configure the switches at both sides to put half of the ports on one network and half of the ports on the other network, and have one cable going between them. This means that if the switch is perfectly secure, no matter how insecure the cameras are, no matter how many network devices you take control over on the office network, you can't jump into the CCTV network. But if we can take control of the switch or the routers, that might allow you to use a VLAN that you're not supposed to have access to, or even create your own VLAN to hide your own hacking traffic on. So that's why I might want to take into a switch or router. Web server, this is probably the most important because a lot of companies have intranets with web servers running on their local networks, which might be running an old version of Windows because they've got legacy software. So it's running an old version of IIS, which is Microsoft's web server, which means it might be really vulnerable. Running, for example, an out-of-date PHP app or ASP.NET app. And that means that's a really good attack vector. And if that's integrating with other parts of the network because it needs to for business reasons, or it has just not been properly configured or hasn't been properly isolated, that could be a great first point into the network. Domain controllers are one of the most powerful devices on a Windows network, and most companies' corporate networks have a Windows backbone. And so these handle all of the user authentication, all of the computer authentication, the resource share management, passwords, permission groups, all of that is handled on the domain controllers, which means that if you can take control of that, not only do you get a massive store of password hashes, which are not hashed very securely, but you can control the entire network and no one can stop you. Microsoft's advice on how to recover from a compromised domain controller is to literally start again, because you can bury yourself so deep in the network that it can be almost impossible to find where you've been. So domain controllers, it's like root above root. It's super root. If you wanted to think of in Linux terms, it's such a powerful position. IoT device. It's probably be IoT devices because every network's having more and more and more. For example, CCTV cameras, I guess, one of the more legacy conventional type of device, but there are so many. For example, in a home situation, fridges and stuff. An interesting one that I actually had a little bit of involvement with is at a public swimming pool, or any large swimming pool for that matter, because the swimming pool needs to have all its chemicals kept exactly correct. There's this thing which can put, it's got lots of different valves on it, it can put chemicals into the pool, and it also measures how many chemicals are going in. And so it can be managed remotely. It's got a web interface and it connects to the network. If you were to attack this maliciously, you could put heaps of chlorine or acid into the pool and literally hurt people physically. But that's got very poor security on it. So that's something that in the real world, you need to secure that. And how do you do that? Well, when you have a vulnerable IoT device, you might think about putting it on its own VLAN, as we discussed earlier, and putting it behind a VPN, which we'll discuss in a minute. And so making it so that you can't get to that device, no matter how badly secured that device is, putting it behind firewalls and all that sort of thing. And there's many other IoT devices for every function you could think of like that, which often have real world implications. And workstations. Every network needs workstations because otherwise work can't get done. And if you get someone to click on a link in an email or download something malicious, that could be another very first attack vector. So, why won't my slides advance? There. So that's a summary of the appliances on the left. And there's also obviously lots of different protocols, which relate to the different things, which you should probably have seen most of these before. HTTP, SSS, SSH. You'll be familiar with. SMB or Samba is the Windows file sharing protocol, which is a lot more secure in recent versions, but it's still the sort of thing that you don't want to be accessible on the internet because it's still like a bit legacy for Microsoft. And you've got IMAP and its associated email protocols, DNS, which we've discussed, ARP, DHCP, SNMP, which is Simple Network Management Protocol, which is often used to manage devices, and NTP is the time protocol. And you might not think that NTP has actually got a lot of issues because by default it's not secure. And if you can corrupt the time on a device, you can potentially use an out-of-date certificate that you've compromised or cause other authentication flows that require on time to fail. For example, in Windows, Kerberos fails if the devices at the end have clocks that are more than 5 minutes out. So if you can corrupt the time on a device, you can potentially corrupt the authentication, do relay attacks, all those sorts of things, which is why that's often unthought of attack vector. So VPNs are not just used to bypass geo-blocking or not just used to escape the Great Firewall. They are used in business every day, potentially. And at its most simple, it allows you to connect to a network from another network, often the internet. Why do we care about them? Well, because it's a way into the network. It's an attack vector. And depending on how they're set up, it might be a public-private key pair or a pre-shared key or username password. And if those passwords aren't very complex or strong, you get them through some other method, maybe you can just log in that way. Or maybe the encryption protocol is not very secure. Like PPTP, an old VPN protocol, is so insecure that you can't really, no one should be using that, but people might still do use it because devices support it. Then on the network, we have firewalls. So every network needs a firewall. It's a question of how good the firewall is and how well configured it is. At its basic, a firewall blocks traffic that you don't want going through and allows other traffic through. And so it can put it, like it's not just attacking devices at will. They can either be software running on
Alex Rodriguez.
Pardon, sorry? Okay, I'll just keep going. If you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me or ask in the chat. So it can either be a piece of software running on the computer, which would be host-based, or an actual device on the network, which would be network-based. And NAT routers either have built-in firewalls or, because of their own nature, function as a firewall. But in larger corporate networks, you probably won't be using those as much. So 3 generations of firewall. At its most basic is a packet filter, which takes in a packet of data from the network and says which IP address is this from, which IP address is this to, what port is this from, what port is this to, what time is it, maybe a handful of other criteria, and then allows or denies it. Pretty simple firewall. Stateful firewalls, remember what's going through them previously and do a bit more advanced filtering. And then application level firewalls. At this, what we have here are things that are decoding the actual HTTP at the application level in the OSI model, decoding the email, scanning the text of it, scanning for viruses. You might even be doing man in the middle on HTTPS. So they're much more advanced and do a much deeper level of inspection. For example, Monash actually has an application level firewall called it's the web application filter, which checks for like outgoing payloads and other things to try and just protect people and websites and people being malicious on Monash's network, which is why you have to either use a VPN in some instances from Monash or use an HTTPS site for some of our CTF challenges to work because the file's blocking it. Intrusion detection and prevention systems sort of like a firewall, but they just monitor things more generally, and they're looking for suspicious behavior. So they might even be like nowadays AI-based, machine learning-based, and they look for suspicious behavior. And so that's another thing to be aware of, but I'm not going to go into too much detail there. So how can you avoid a firewall? Well, you can either spoof, so you might be able to change your IP address to a port number or MAC address if it's only determining on that, and you can just like spoof a known host. You might have to tunnel something through from a like thing that's allowed on the network. Might have to use a proxy. So for example, if you can take control of a device inside the network, then you can use that device to get to other parts of the network. And you might also use decoying to like make the logs more difficult to understand. So yeah, that's firewalls. Now, this is something which is really important, but most networks do really poorly, and that is the security information and event manager. So what this is basically a server or device on the network that all the other devices on the network are configured to send all information, their logs to, basically. It's like a log collator. And having all your logs in one place is really important because it makes it much easier to see what's happening in the entire network. You've only got one thing to monitor, because the reality is if you've got to configure, like, go to 20 different device logs, the logs aren't going to get looked at that often, which means it will be really hard to discover if you've even been compromised. And like nowadays, you've got a whole lot of things with like web-based portals that show you important things, email notifications. You can have AI and other rules set to monitor for suspicious behavior and all that sort of stuff. So you get a much more holistic overview of what's happening on the network, and things that might not be suspicious on their own can get detected. So for example, if someone changes their password, well, okay, that's not suspicious, but then that person then suddenly logs in from a new IP address. Okay, that's probably not suspicious, but then they log into the VPN and start copying some files, and then they access the internet and start sending lots of data to the web server, and all these things together start to look a bit suspicious, which you can detect if you have central logging, but you can't otherwise. Now, looking at the ways of attacking or finding information out about a network, everything in blue are passive methods that won't detect, won't give you away, people won't know you're looking at. So if you just go to a website manually in your browser and start looking around, that's a very normal thing to do. And if you just set up an email inbox and have email come in, that's a normal thing to do. And again, looking up DNS names and pretty much anything that doesn't require you to actively authenticate to the network is going to be passive. But then on the red side, you start sending out thousands of pings to every IP address on the network and start port scanning every device on the network, or trying to get the information about the services running on every device on the network, or try and man in the middle attack someone. That's detectable, and a good network will detect that and log that with, like, as we've already discussed. So if you know what's happening on a network, that's a huge benefit, especially considering most exploits only run on like one piece of software on a particular version. And again, things like social engineering attacks require you to know information about the network. Like if you turn up and say, oh, I'm from Microsoft and they all use Macs, that's going to be a bit suspicious. But if you say, I'm here to service your warranty with your laptop, and you know that that laptop has had like there have been local support calls, or that laptop keeps dropping its Wi-Fi or something, much more believable, much more likely to get through. For example, if you have, say, people using Word 2010 and you're an update behind, you create one email with a Word document attached, and you have a macro that uses that one vulnerability in Word 2010, you could take over the entire company's workstations with one email. And so it's a really good entry point. So what tools do we have to use this? Nmap is probably the first thing you're going to go to just to find out a bit about the network. Wireshark, I guess, would require possibly a bit more of a privileged position, or I guess if you're doing a Wi-Fi scan, Netcat, curl, all these other options on here, just find out about the network. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail about how each of these works, but Nmap, so it allows us to do our ping sweep. It allows us to scan a lot of different TCP ports. There's a heap of different options. Yeah, I'm not going to go into too much detail about how each of these things work. I will mention one thing about TCP scanning, and that's SYN scan is where, okay, it requires a bit of knowledge about how the TCP protocol works. It starts off with a SYN packet, which is a request for the connection to be opened. And if you send off these packets to heaps of different ports and heaps of different computers, and you just wait for the acknowledgements coming from the host, and you can use that to see if there's something running at each port, if that port is listening. And if you get a response, or there's something running there, we can look further. If it comes back as says, yes, I'm a computer here, but I'm not listening, I'm closed, then you know that there's something there, but it's not actively listening, and that might be worth more information. If you get no response, it means the firewall's probably dropped it, or there might not even be a computer at that IP address, which from a security standpoint is what we're aiming for if we're defending a network. But if you're trying to attack, you're hoping for open. And there's a similar sort of thing with UDP packets. So the thing about Nmap is you can script it, which is really powerful. And you can automate things, and in large networks, automating things is important. I'm not going to say much more about this apart from it's very powerful. Netcat allows us to read and write to anything on the network, basically. And it allows us a very high level of control, but it's very bare bones, but also highly scriptable. Wireshark allows us to capture packets and analyze them, which is really important, especially in Wi-Fi. You can do it from just being parked in your car, but if you get a privileged network position or a broadcast port on a switch or something like that, then you can have a heap of data, and you have all the data go from the network. And so not only does that let you learn about the network, but it allows you to actually steal data going over the network. Again, this is why hacking a switch could be useful. You hack a switch and you set up to forward everything to a particular port that you've got a computer running on. You just log everything coming in. That's very powerful. And so you can do things like filter based on MAC address or IP address. There's a bit of Wireshark syntax there. It seems I've come to the end of my presentation. There's some other resources. Because I've just been able to steamroll through. So this is quite fast. I'm happy to take questions, and I want to take questions. I was expecting a few more questions as we went through. Someone please say something, just to say questions, feedback, thoughts.
All right, don't worry, we haven't all gone to sleep. But I do believe Daniel did have one minor side announcement though, not majorly related to CorpNet, more just in the general field of having community-based CTF.
I mean, that, and also I had a question about CorpNet.
Okay, do you want to start with the question about CorpNet?
Yes. Going back to your slide previously about the tools, I've heard of pretty much all of them except for iWitness. Basically, what is iWitness?
I don't actually know, sorry, because some of these slides I repurposed, and this is one of them.
Solid. All right. Sorry for making you admit that. Let's move on. Basically, what I was going to say about the CTF thing was I was thinking about doing a community-driven CTF soon. So that being more so a CTF less focused on the competitors and more on the people making the challenges. That being basically challenging you guys to try and make a challenge, to learn about it in a new field, and then attempting to and then basically make a challenge, and then we'll all try each other's challenges out and have fun and do all fun stuff like that. I wanted to gauge sort of reactions of if people would be happy to do something like that before I go ahead and, you know, make marketing material and shit. So any thoughts would be appreciated. Ah, perfect.
We'll most likely end up putting an announcement in the main Discord or on Facebook just to try and gauge interest there as well.
Yeah, this is more so like, because I know you got, like, the people that show up here are more than likely the people to try and do it. That's what this is. But yes, of course, there will be other announcements in the more mainstream channels as well. That is the end of my announcement.
All right, so, and with that, and in lieu of any other questions, we may end up finishing up our workshop a bit early today. Don't forget, as always, we have the attendance forms and survey to fill out. If you guys get the chance to, that helps us a lot. Helps us improve the workshops, helps us get funding from MSA, all the fun stuff. But aside from that, that's all we have planned, unless anyone has any last questions.